The school stood off the main road, hidden behind ancient trees whose branches blocked the sun. It was an old brick building built at the beginning of the last century, with long corridors and stairs creaking with every step. Despite its age, the school continued to work, but its reputation left much to be desired. In recent years, several students have transferred out of it, and there were rumors that the administration was trying to hide something terrible. However, no one could say exactly what it was. It all started with an incident 10 years ago. One of the students disappeared right during class. There were no records, witnesses, or traces. It was as if he had simply disappeared. After weeks of fruitless searches, the case was closed, blamed on the escape. But years later, teachers and students noticed oddities, missing things, doors that opened on their own, and noises that came from enclosed spaces. Some students claimed to have heard muffled footsteps in the empty corridors. There were reports of these cases in the school archive, but the administration categorically forbade anyone to study them. Against the background of these rumors, a group of high school students decided to find out the truth. Each of them had their own reason to participate. Emily, a quiet, excellent student, wanted to protect her younger brother, who had recently become afraid to go to school. James, the captain of the basketball team, was looking for thrills, and Laura, who was interested in journalism, dreamed of writing an article that would shock everyone. But the main engine was Mike, their friend, who had lost his sister in the same building in the past. It seemed to him that her disappearance was connected with the school. The group gathered in the evening when the school was already empty. Everyone had a flashlight, and Laura took an old map of the building she found in the library. Mike insisted that they start in the basement, a place where access was strictly prohibited. He suspected that that was where the answers were hidden. The basement was littered with old boxes and broken furniture. Dust hung in the air, settling on the clothes. In the far corner they found a closed door with a faded sign, "Office Space." A crowbar from the workshop helped with the lock, and a narrow room filled with metal cabinets opened up in front of them. Mike pointed the flashlight inside, and folders with documents appeared in the light. Most of them were reports on academic achievements and old repairs, but one folder stood out. On its spine was written, "Archive. 1975 to 1980. The documents inside described the disappearances of several students. Each time, the reasons remained unclear. In one of the reports, someone made a note, "Check the ventilation shafts." Emily looked at her friends, "Do you think it's important?" James shrugged, but Laura took a picture of the document on her phone. They started looking for the ventilation shaft in question. Finally, they found a closed grate in the corner of the room. James unscrewed it with difficulty, and they looked inside. The shaft led down to where they thought nothing should be. Suddenly Laura noticed something strange. Someone had written numbers on one of the walls of the mine, 21-07. Mike pulled out a notebook and wrote them down. Gathering their courage, they decided to go down. They took turns climbing into a narrow passage that led into a dark, dank tunnel. The floor was damp, and the smell of dampness was in my nose. Old wires were visible on the walls in places, and in some places even rusty metal plates were visible. Suddenly, the tunnel split into two. The group stopped, not knowing where to go next. Suddenly, a barely discernible noise was heard from one of the tracks, as if someone was moving there. Could it be rats? James suggested, but his voice sounded uncertain. Mike, on the other hand, looked determined. "We have to find out what's in there," he said, and headed towards the noise. When they reached the end of the tunnel, they saw a room. It looked more like a laboratory, with tables covered in dust and old equipment. There was a battered diary on one of the tables. Laura picked it up and began to read it aloud. Experiment number 5. Purpose: to assess the psychological impact of isolation. Her voice was trembling. The following entries were even scarier. Test subject: student. Age, 12. Result, negative. A second attempt is necessary. Emily felt her legs give way. They were conducting experiments on the children? Mike grabbed the diary and started flipping through it further. The last entry was handwritten: the tunnels under Section B are closed. The object is isolated. Access is closed. Is this about those who are missing? Emily whispered, and her voice trembled. They had no time to discuss what they had read when a rumble was heard in the distance. Someone or something was moving towards them. "We need to get out," James shouted, and the group rushed back to the exit. However, when they came to the place of bifurcation, they realized that the tunnel had changed. An iron door appeared in their path, which had not been there before. Mike noticed the scratched inscription on the door, 21-07. He remembered the numbers from the ventilation shaft. "It's a code," he guessed. With trembling hands, Emily entered the numbers on the old mechanical lock. The click was too loud, breaking the silence. There was an exit outside the door. They ran until the school was far behind them. It was only later, when they were able to catch their breath, that Mike realized that they had left the diary in the tunnel. It was their only clue. Upon returning home, each of them felt both relieved and worried. The diary they had left was haunting. Laura tried to call Mike several times, but he didn't answer. Emily was sitting in her room and flipping through the photos she had taken in the tunnel. On one of them, she noticed something she hadn't seen before: a dark silhouette in the corner of the lab, looking like a man. She hurriedly sent the picture to the group's general chat. Mike answered first: "It's just a reflection. Don't screw yourself up." But his words sounded like he didn't believe in what he was writing. The next day, they gathered at Laura's house to discuss what had happened. James suggested that we forget about everything. "We did everything we could. This school should have been closed long ago, let the adults deal with it." But Emily couldn't calm down. "Have you seen the recordings? These are not just old experiments. Someone continued them. Maybe even now. And what do you suggest? Go back there?" Mike snapped in a harsh tone. His gaze was strange, as if he knew something but didn't want to say it. Laura spread out the photographs she had taken in the laboratory on the table. One of them had a close-up image of the diary. There was a date in the corner of the page, the month and year that coincided with the disappearance of Mike's sister. He turned pale. "You think she is? Could she be one of those subjects?" His voice was trembling. Emily stared at him in silence, not knowing what to say. The next morning, a strange incident was reported on the news. One of the school's employees, a caretaker, is missing. His car was left in the parking lot, and only his keys and phone were found in the building. Laura was reading the news aloud when Mike abruptly stood up. "It's a sign. We missed something. We have to go back." "Are you crazy?" James jumped up. "It's not safe there." But Mike had already made up his mind. He knew that the answers to all his questions were hidden in those tunnels. They returned to school at night. This time they had lanterns, ropes, and even pepper spray with them, for the sake of complacency. The building seemed even darker than on their first visit. The walls whispered with drafts, and the creaking of the floorboards echoed. When they went down to the basement, they noticed that the tunnels now looked different. Some of the passageways were littered with debris, as if someone had deliberately tried to close them. There was a strong smell of rot in the air. Mike walked ahead, holding a lantern in his hands. Suddenly he stopped and pointed at something on the floor. It was an old wooden box with withered papers and photographs inside. Laura picked up one of them and gasped. The picture showed a class of children, but most of the faces were crossed out. The year was written on the back of the picture, as well as a note, "Isolated." "They've known all along," she whispered. Further down the tunnel, they came across a new door made of heavy metal. There was a red inscription on it: "Access is denied." "This is no longer a school zone," James remarked. "Something is clearly wrong here." Mike found a key card on the floor and attached it to the panel. The door opened with a loud creak. There was another lab inside, but this one looked new. The computers were still running, and the screens displayed graphs and lists of names. Laura went to one of the monitors and was horrified to find out Mike's last name. "This can't be true." Emily overcame her fear and opened one of the file cabinets. There were medical records. She recognized one of them as Mike's sister. Mike, they used her. But why? Suddenly the door slammed shut behind them. James rushed to the panel, but it no longer reacted. "Someone wants to leave us here." "Stop it," he shouted. Mike noticed a camera in the corner and realized they were being watched. Footsteps sounded from the far room. They were heavy, measured. "Someone's here," Emily whispered, clutching James. A man in a lab coat came out of the darkness. His face was half hidden by a mask, and his gloved hands were holding what looked like a syringe. "You shouldn't have come here," his voice was cold. Mike stepped forward. "Who are you? What have you done to my sister?" The man tilted his head as if considering the answer. Then he nodded at the monitor. "She was one of the first. The rest are after her. But you won't leave to tell." He pressed a button on the wall, and acrid gas began to flow from the ventilation shafts. Laura screamed, rushing to the other door. They barely found a way out, but Mike lingered. He couldn't leave without knowing the whole truth. The last thing the friends heard was his scream. The school was closed the next day. The official news said there was a gas leak, but only 3 people knew what really happened. Mike's diary was found on the floor of the tunnel a few months later. There was one word in it: alive. Mike, who remained in the lab, stood motionless, his breathing quickened with a mixture of fear and determination. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, and gas began to fill the room. He barely covered his face with a t-shirt, trying not to inhale the poisonous fumes. At that moment, he noticed an emergency lever in the corner, which, in his opinion, could turn off the gas supply. He lunged for the lever, but felt a sharp pain in his shoulder. The stranger who had just been watching them struck him with something heavy. Mike fell, his face contorted in pain, but he was still struggling. The stranger bent over him, pulled out a syringe and coldly said, "You're getting too close to the truth, boy." But Mike suddenly kicked him, knocking him down. He crawled over to the lever and pulled it. The gas stopped flowing. However, this did not save him. The stranger quickly recovered and hit Mike on the head with all his might. Laura, Emily, and James made their way out of the building, breathing gusts of fresh air. Their faces were pale, and their eyes glittered with terror. "He's still there. We have to go back for Mike," Laura screamed. But James grabbed her arm. "There's nothing we can do. You've seen what's going on there. If we go back, we will die." They hesitated. Emily looked at the school, her eyes filled with tears. She knew Mike probably wouldn't make it out. Inside the school, the situation was getting worse. Mike was lying on the floor, his head was bleeding. The stranger bent over him, checking his pulse. He then dragged Mike's body into another room filled with strange equipment. Mike opened his eyes. He came to his senses with difficulty and realized that he was tied to a metal table. There were medical instruments around him, and most of them were clearly being misused. "Do you think you won by pulling that lever?" the stranger said. "You just accelerated the inevitable." Mike tried to pull away, but his arms and legs were firmly fixed. The stranger raised a huge scalpel over him. "Everyone who finds out the truth stays here forever." The next day, Police received an anonymous call about missing teenagers who were seen entering the old school. When law enforcement agencies arrived at the scene, they found an open door in the basement. There was an oppressive silence inside the tunnels. One of the officers came across a metal table with medical instruments scattered around it. There were traces of blood on the table, but Mike's body was missing. They found an old diary in the other corner of the room. The last entry in it was made in a shaky handwriting. "I know I can't get out. They're still here. If anyone is reading this, run. Otherwise, you will be next." Laura, Emily, and James sat silently in James's room, thinking about what had happened. Neither of them dared to speak first. Suddenly Laura's phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "You made the right choice by leaving. But he paid for you." Laura's heart skipped a beat. She showed the message to the others. "Who could it be?" Emily whispered. James, pale, silently got up and closed all the curtains in the room. The next day, the school was demolished under the pretext of the danger of old structures. Laura and her friends did not go to the scene. They knew that it was better to leave the past in ruins. However, a week later, a small box appeared on Laura's doorstep. Inside was Mike's blood-stained badge with his name and photo. There was a note underneath it. "You have forgotten what you missed at the very beginning. The truth will always find you." Laura realized that someone was still watching them. They escaped. It's been a week since Laura found the box with Mike's badge. She kept everything a secret from the others, hoping that this horror would finally end. But, as it turned out, this was just the beginning. One night, Laura woke up to a noise. Dim light from the hallway filtered through the half-open door into her room. Someone had turned on her laptop, even though she was sure she had turned it off before going to bed. My heart started beating faster. She got out of bed and carefully walked over to the table. A program similar to a video chat opened on the laptop screen. In the center of the screen was a dark room illuminated by a faint flashing light. At first glance, Laura didn't notice anything, but suddenly a face appeared on the screen. It was so close to the camera that Laura involuntarily recoiled. "You know too much," a cold male voice said. The program closed on its own. Laura remained sitting in total darkness, feeling her body tremble with fear. The next day, Laura decided to meet with Emily and James. She knew she couldn't handle it alone anymore. "I think we're still being watched," Laura said, looking at her friends. "You're just being paranoid," James said, although his voice sounded unconvincing. "No, listen," Emily interrupted. "If that's really the case, we can't just sit back. You need to understand what they want." Laura put the box with Mike's badge on the table. Emily screamed, and James turned pale. "It was on my doorstep," Laura said softly. "And last night, someone hacked into my laptop." Emily took the badge, examined it carefully and noticed something that no one had noticed before, a small engraving on the back. "It says room 312 here. This was the room where we found that magazine, wasn't it?" They exchanged anxious glances. Despite their fear, the trio decided to return to the ruins of the school. At night, armed with lanterns, they made their way through the fences. The school was in complete disrepair, but the basement remained untouched. "If we want to find out what happened to Mike, we need to go all the way," James said, trying to cheer himself up. They went down into the tunnels. It was cold and quiet there, and every sound of their footsteps echoed. When they reached the door with the number 312, James hesitated. "Are you sure we should do this?" Emily asked in a whisper. Laura didn't answer. She pulled on the handle, and the door opened with a soft creak. The room looked as if it had just been abandoned. There were cups with dried coffee remnants on the tables, and documents were scattered everywhere. There were pictures of teenagers on the walls, among whom Laura recognized Mike. There was an old tape recorder in the corner of the room with a cassette inside. James carefully pressed the play button. The man's voice began to speak. The experiment is over. Subject 3 showed the expected reaction. Eliminate the rest. The program continues. If someone finds this entry, know that you are already on the list. The tape recorder clicked and went silent. What does this mean? Emily whispered. Laura moved closer to the wall where the photos were hanging and noticed something that was not visible at first glance. One of the photos showed Mike himself, but behind him was the masked figure that Laura had seen on the laptop screen. They're watching us, Laura said. This is not an accident. Suddenly, footsteps were heard from behind. James turned around, pointing the flashlight, but saw only emptiness. There's someone here, he shouted. The footsteps were getting closer. Laura grabbed the tape recorder and shouted, "Let's run." They ran out of the room, leaving the door open behind them. The tunnel seemed endless now, and the sounds of footsteps were getting closer. They got out, and only then did the footsteps stop. James was out of breath and looked around. "There's no one here," he said, breathing heavily. Laura, James and Emily ran to the car, which they parked a few blocks from the ruins. All three were sweating and breathing heavily. Laura held the tape recorder tightly in her hands, which now seemed to her not just a clue, but a ticket to an even bigger nightmare. What now? James asked as he started the car. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and his eyes were constantly darting around. "We have to give it all to the police," Laura said firmly. "They have to figure it out." "Are you serious? Do you think they'll believe our stories about some kind of experiments and—" He broke off, noticing how Laura gave him an icy look. "We have a recording, photos." "That's enough to start an investigation," Emily interjected, trying to calm them both down. James nodded reluctantly. The car pulled away, but the tension in the cabin became almost palpable. No one spoke, but everyone felt that they were being followed. Even as they drove out into the lighted street, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched from every shadow. They arrived at the police station near midnight. The station was almost empty, except for one officer on duty, an elderly woman with a stern expression on her face. Her gray hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her gaze seemed to burn through. "What do you have?" "What is it?" she asked, barely glancing at the trio. Laura put the tape recorder and photos on the counter. Emily tried to explain everything as quickly as possible, but the words got confused. James looked around nervously, feeling uncomfortable in this place. "Wait here," the officer said and took the things. She disappeared into the room behind them, leaving them alone with the oppressive silence. A few minutes passed, which seemed like an eternity. Laura noticed James and Emily looking at each other, clearly sensing something strange. The heavy sound of footsteps brought them back to reality. The same officer entered the room, but now her expression has changed. It became almost lifeless. "Where did you get this?" "What is it?" she asked coldly, staring at Laura intently. "We found this at the old school," Laura began to explain, but the officer interrupted her. "You'd better forget about it. These items will be confiscated. Now go away." "What?" James stepped forward. "This is evidence. You must." "I said go away," the woman snapped, staring intently into his eyes. Laura noticed her hand slip to the weapon on her belt. She grabbed James by the arm and pulled him towards the exit. "Come on, James," she said softly. "We'll do it differently." When they left the station, Emily said softly. She knew. This woman is hiding something. Obviously, Laura nodded. "We can't trust anyone." On the way home, Laura noticed that their car was not alone on the road again. In the distance, they were followed by headlights, which, despite turns and stops, always remained at the same distance. "We're being followed," she whispered. "I know," James replied, stepping on the gas. He turned onto a side road, hoping to get away from the intruders. The car behind me also turned off. Laura's heart was beating like a hammer. "James, over here!" Emily shouted, pointing to a narrow path leading into the forest. The car flew into the path, the wheels skidded on the wet ground. James turned off the headlights and turned off the engine. They sat in complete silence, trying not to breathe too loudly. "Do you think they've lost us?" Emily whispered. The sound of footsteps was heard in response. Someone was approaching. "Run!" Laura shouted, jumping out of the car. They ran deep into the forest without looking back. The footsteps of the pursuer grew louder. Branches whipped at their faces, but fear drove them forward. Suddenly, an old shack appeared in front of them. She smelled musty and rotten. Seeing no other way out, they rushed in. The shack was small, with a low ceiling and the smell of death. An old woman was sitting in the corner. Her gray hair was matted, her face was deeply lined, and her eyes were empty and dead. "You found the wrong place, children," she said in a low but threatening voice. "Help us!" Laura screamed. The woman slowly stood up. She had a rusty cleaver in her hands. "No one will help you. You went where you shouldn't have and brought them to me," she said, stepping up to Laura. James tried to grab a chair to defend himself, but the woman was incredibly fast. She hit him with the back of her cleaver, knocking him down. "They've been following me for years, but now they have new toys," she chuckled. Laura grabbed Emily's arm and they rushed to the door. The woman furiously rushed after them, but Laura managed to grab a stick and block the door from the outside. The footsteps behind him did not stop. They ran out onto the road and saw their pursuer, a masked man, already standing in front of the car. "This is the end," Laura whispered, squeezing Emily's hand. The mask slowly turned towards them, and a familiar cold voice rang out behind them. "Welcome home."